As I'm sure has happened to you on occasion, every once in a while something will trigger for me a memory completely out of the blue. Something I hadn't thought about in years. And in fact, that happened to me this very week, actually while working on this sermon. I suddenly remembered something that happened to me when I was around 7 or 8 years old. And honestly, I don't think I've thought about this since the day it happened. We were in Cool Springs visiting my grandparents, and my father took me and my next older sibling, my sister Jo, to go to see something that he wanted to show us. Now, why that day he wanted to show us this, I don't know. I have no idea. But we got in the car with him and drove toward North Union, which is the next small farming community just down the road, and where another set of my great-grandparents is buried. And when we got to the place that my father was looking for, he pulled the car off the road and parked. And we got out, and we climbed a fence. For some reason, I remember climbing the fence. And we walked across a field into the woods on the far side of the field. And not far into the woods was what my father wanted us to see. It was a cabin, a log cabin, or more precisely, what remained of a log cabin that was in an advanced state of decay. Clearly, no one had lived in this cabin for years, and I mean a lot of years. And there really didn't seem to be anything particularly special about it, so I couldn't imagine why my father wanted us to see it. But then he told us that when he was a child, his grandfather had told him that a very famous man had once lived in that very cabin. Now, being 7 or 8 years old at the time, I didn't know many famous men or women. But I did know the person that my father told me had lived there. And I was impressed. Because the person my father said had lived in that now derelict cabin was Davy Crockett. Now, my father went on to say that he wasn't really sure that was true. And in fact, I'm pretty confident that my father was about 99% sure that wasn't true. But it might possibly have been true, since the fact is, Davy Crockett actually did live somewhere around there in the years before he left to go to Texas. And of course, that was all I needed. And I wanted desperately to believe it was true, since being that close to the place where Davy Crockett had lived was about the coolest thing I could imagine. Well, unfortunately, after that day, we never went back to that place. And for some reason, later on, I never thought to ask my father to show me again where we had been. And trying to find that same place now would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So my own children will never have the chance to stand on what passes for holy ground in the greenest state in the land of the free, the king of the wild frontier. For the past several weeks in my sermons, I have been talking about the importance of keeping our eyes on the big picture, on the long term, and not letting ourselves be carried away by the emotions of the moment or caught up merely in appearances. some sense of that bigger picture. Staying focused on the long term is very important for us because it allows us to keep things in our lives in perspective so that we're not blown about by merely passing fads or enthusiasms of the moment or just the normal highs and lows of daily existence. And the fruits of having this kind of healthy perspective, I think, are especially important because they are things like hope and a non-judgmental spirit, the kinds of things that can be a real blessing in the communities in which we live, work, and worship, and can make a significant difference in the quality of the lives that we ourselves experience. But because we are mortal creatures, it's very easy for us to lose sight of that bigger picture. Because the fact is, we don't live in the big picture, we live in the present. And in the present, the concerns of the moment are what is most real and certainly most pressing. Which is why reminders of that bigger picture can be very helpful to us. Reminders that keep us aware that whatever may be happening in our world at any given moment, however important it may seem to us at the time, it is not ever the whole story. We need reminders then that help keep us focused on that remind us about the big picture and help us to keep things in our life in perspective. Now, one form such reminders take is monuments. Now, by monuments, I don't just mean statues and plaques and other official kinds of markers, but anything that marks a place as something of note. Anything that marks a place where something happened in the past. It can even be the ruins of a log cabin. But they are important reminders for us that our lives are only a small part of a much bigger story. A story that's larger than any one of us, larger even than all of us. And that is one of the great things about living in Philadelphia. Because here, there are monuments everywhere. You can hardly walk down a street in Center City without passing by something that reminds you that there were people living here long before we were. That important things happened in this town long before we showed up. And being reminded of that, being reminded that we are part of that bigger story can be an enormous help for us all. Unfortunately, though, the very thing that makes such reminders, such monuments, helpful to us is also the very thing that renders them susceptible to neglect and oversight. Precisely because we are so focused on today and all of the pressing concerns of the moment, all of those things that need to be attended to right now, longer-term concerns tend to get pushed out of the way or get put on the back burner and become things that we'll get around to when we've got some extra time or extra money to worry about them. A perfect example of this is how often people put off making or updating their wills. Everyone knows how important that is, how much everyone needs to do that. But of course, it's not something that you have to do today. It can wait till tomorrow. And before you know it, tomorrow has become next year or even never. Which goes back to the reason why we need those reminders in the first place. why such reminders, such monuments of whatever sort are so important, so critical to living a full life, which is, of course, the theme of Yeats' famous poem, Sailing to Byzantium, the first two stanzas of which are printed on the cover of your worship bulletin today. And I do hope you'll take time to look at that poem and reflect on it. This is also the subject of Haggai's lament in our Old Testament lesson today. Haggai certainly is not one of the famous prophets of Israel. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Haggai is pretty obscure. And it's only this one time that a reading from Haggai ever shows up in our lectionary. He's not in the league of an Isaiah or a Jeremiah or even a Micah or an Amos. Haggai is perhaps the most minor of all the minor prophets. He had only one issue, only one concern, and that was the temple in Jerusalem, which in his day, and certainly much to his dismay, was in about the same condition as Davy Crockett's cabin was when I saw it all those years ago. The temple had been left in ruins by the Babylonians, and despite a few tentative efforts to rebuild it, it was pretty much still in ruins. And the problem Haggai had is that people seemed to be content with that. That was okay. Now, of course, they had their own lives to worry about, their own homes and workplaces to rebuild. So leaving the temple for later seemed to be, in the general consensus of most folks in Jerusalem, a position that made perfectly good sense, given the circumstances. Except for one thing. Because given the circumstances, without some connection to the past, without some hope for the future, there was no way anyone was ever going to rebuild Jerusalem. There was, in fact, no reason for anyone to rebuild Jerusalem, because Jerusalem without the temple was not Jerusalem at all. In fact, as Haggai seems to have realized, it was only from a renewed sense of the significance of their past, and out of that then some hope for a better future, that the people were going to be able to draw the strength and summon the resources for them to undertake the massive task of rebuilding a city that had been, for all practical purposes, totally destroyed. And the key to their being able to do that was rebuilding the temple, of gathering the people together, summoning them to a common purpose, building the temple, and from there going on to build Jerusalem again. The truth of the matter was no temple, no Jerusalem, which is why Haggai argued they had to rebuild the temple. Not later on, but then. Several years ago, we hosted a meeting of Philadelphia Presbytery here at First Church. After the meeting, Barbara Chapel and I were talking, and a young intern at a ministry elsewhere in Center City that shall remain nameless came up and asked us about our building. Well, we gave him a little bit of the history, told about the efforts we were undertaking to restore the building, and his response that day, his very glib response, was that, well, we should just tear this building down and build something more functional. I thought Barbara was going to have a stroke. What he clearly didn't understand, and what, to be fair, he probably couldn't have understood, is that without this building, this church would not exist. Now, certainly a church could exist, but it wouldn't be this church, because this building has made us the church that we are today. A church with an incredibly strong sense of its heritage in the past, and out of that, a rock-solid commitment to remaining a beacon of hope for this community far into the future. Because this church, as anyone knows who has ever set foot in it, this church was not built for the short term. It was built for the long term. And that's who we are and always will be. Which is why maintaining this building, as great a challenge as it is so important. Today in this building, we're observing All Saints Sunday, a day for us to remember and to give thanks for the lives of those who have gone before us, which is perhaps the most important reminder of all of that bigger picture I've been talking about. This year, for the first time, we've invited you to bring pictures of friends and loved ones whose faith inspired you and helped to make you the person that you are today. Right below me on this table, and I mean that, directly below me, right there, is a picture of my grandfather, the first Jesse B. Garner, and the picture is of him teaching a Sunday school class in the Cool Springs Church. It was his father, William Thomas Garner, who told my father about Davy Crockett's cabin. Sadly, that cabin is gone, or it might as well be, since I have no idea where on earth to find it. What I do know, though, is where this church still is, and where this church will be for years and years to come. It'll be right here, and still proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, right here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forever.